Thank you for joining us for this sermon podcast from the Congregational Church of Needham, Massachusetts, United Church of Christ, where no matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you're invited and welcome. Our sermon for today, Sunday, November 22nd, 2020, is entitled Sharing, a Miracle for 5 or 5,000. It's a reflection on a reading from the Gospel of John, chapter 6, verses 1 through 14. If you enjoy this podcast and would like to learn more about our open and affirming ministries at the Congregational Church of Needham, simply head over to our website, www.needhamucc.org. Thank you. A reading from the Gospel according to John, chapter 6, verses 1 through 14. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him, because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" Jesus said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get even a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." Friends, God is still speaking to the world. May our hearts be open to listen and to respond. Amen.
This story we just heard, this story about Jesus feeding people, is remarkable. And it's remarkable because we find this story of Jesus feeding the multitudes in all 4 of our Gospels. And more than that, Matthew and Mark tell this story twice. I remember hearing this story for the first time in Sunday school as a child, and thinking that Jesus was walking around these 5,000 people with a basket, and he would pull out a loaf of bread, and for every loaf he pulled out, another one would appear in its place. Sort of like that trick that magicians do, where they pull a seemingly never-ending handkerchief out of their sleeve. But this story is told 6 times in the 4 Gospels because it's about more than magic or bread being multiplied. This is a story about people being fed and transformed. So let's get a little bit of background of what was happening before the loaves and fishes moment. John the Baptist, John, Jesus' cousin, had been executed by the authorities. John, who baptized and loved and mentored Jesus. After Jesus hears this news, he goes off for some self-care to a quiet place. However, the hills soon fill up with people who have heard the stories about this Jesus, people who want to see and hear him for themselves, people, many who are hungry, without housing, marginalized, in need of something, or they wouldn't be out there following Jesus. And from the stories they had heard, they thought maybe, just maybe, Jesus could help. The writer of Matthew says that there were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So let's say most men have a spouse and at least one child. We're looking at 10,000 people or more. Jesus comes back and sees this crowd of people who have followed him from town, and he is filled with compassion. And he knows that this big group of people is going to need to eat soon. Well, Philip, these people are hungry, Jesus says. Where can we get some food? Philip maybe can't believe his ears and says, Jesus, more than half a year's salary couldn't feed these people even a little bit. In this same story in Matthew, the disciples say, Jesus, send the people into town and let them worry about their own food. But Andrew says, hey, Jesus, a kid over here has 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And then, maybe realizing how outlandish this sounds, Andrew adds, but what good is that for a crowd of this size? But it's that idea from the youth, 5 loaves and 2 fish, that sparks a miracle. It is, of course, an absurdly inadequate solution, and yet it's the beginning of monumental change. Jesus has an idea. Bring me what little you have, and let's just see what happens. And maybe this is the miracle, that a few loaves of bread are handed out, and each person in the presence of Jesus and surrounded by perhaps friends, but many, many more strangers, and having just watched this child give up his lunch, maybe each person is moved to give whatever they can. And so perhaps the people traveling had a few scraps of bread already wrapped up in their bag because they anticipated being away from town late. Maybe some folks who had a little bit more money ran back into town and bought whatever they could. Maybe others went to the nearest houses and said, hey, something is happening out there. Can you help? And others who didn't have anything to give gratefully received. And maybe these same little stories played out over and over again among 5,000, 10,000, 15,000 people until after everyone had eaten, everyone's hunger was satisfied, and there were 12 baskets chock full of leftovers. Instead of a magician, we have a deep truth, an abiding God who is in it for the long haul, who is moving hearts to undo the knots of oppression that we are tangled in, much like the disciples who still couldn't imagine something bigger than what they'd always known that day in the meadow when Jesus asked them to feed hungry people. You can hear the resistance in their words. We brought our lunches with us, Jesus. They can go find food too. And even when there's the beginning of a plan, they are still bound to their scarcity. Jesus, there are so many people, and we don't have enough to go around. Who is going to pay for it, Jesus? We could not afford to care for these poor, hungry people, even if we worked for half a year. This is a story that sounds familiar. Today, there are still hungry people to feed, and the amount of hungry people is growing. In the midst of this pandemic, reliance on our food banks has soared. Even before this current economic crisis, the Federal Reserve had found that 4, now 3 in 10 Americans did not have the savings or other resources to cover a $400 expense. That's a statistic that I'm sure you've heard before. There is a system of scarcity, in Jesus's day and our own, where the distribution of food, something as simple and life-giving as food, withholds power from some and compounds it for others. But Jesus doesn't operate out of this system of scarcity that the disciples are bound to. Jesus's ministry is rooted in a theology of abundance. Share what you've got, because in this kingdom that we are building, there will be more than enough food, more than enough money, power, honor, and love for everyone to thrive. Jesus turns the system that people have known and expect upside down by feeding hungry people who cannot afford to feed themselves, by healing people who are sick, by welcoming people into his circle that society had cast aside. And when the people gathered see God's abundance in action, when they are fed and nourished, they are transformed. In the same way that a God of unimaginable grace and abundance can transform each one of us over and over into Christ followers who get up and add our own bread to the basket, who give of ourselves, who feed the hungry, who work together to undo injustice. Can we even imagine what God's kingdom of abundance could be like? Can we imagine the whole world transformed? Maybe it's a little uncomfortable to dream of something so new and different. Maybe even just a little bit scary, especially in this time where things already feel so precarious, where we don't know what 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years from now really looks like. I know that the world feels heavy now. We long for a community that cares for one another, a community that will give our scraps of bread so that loaves may be saved for someone else who needs it more. We long for a community that holds our messy, mixed up, complicated lives, where we can be who we are, skinned knees and all. And we long to be a gathered community, not just in spirit, but in body. How can we possibly be asked to give more? But beloved, the world has made it through times very much like these before. And we will too. And remember that it was during a time of deep sorrow and confusion that Jesus, with all of these big, heavy feelings, was moved to compassion, to teach, to heal, and to feed. In the midst of his loss and pain, to believe still in God's abundance. So maybe now the miracles for us can be. If we have a little extra, we can give it away so that every family has something on their table to eat. If we long to gather, to be together, we can make wise and mindful decisions. If we haven't been able to imagine that a different world may be possible, maybe the miracle can be that we begin to dream like God does. And maybe right now, today, the miracle can be as simple as praying those words that we imagined the little boy said when he handed Jesus his 5 loaves and 2 fish. Jesus, please, take what I have if you think it will help. Amen.